Hi everyone. So far I have presented 3 videos for Tim Talks Talkies top 25 movies of the 80s. Please do check them on my channel if you haven't seen them. One is for my sister, and then I've done 2 for 2 Vancouver video store managers, which was really a joy to do. Now, before I get into my own personal choices, I'm just going to savour this moment from when Tim was doing his 90s movies top 25 live stream.
So many awesome. I'm looking at lists. Some of them, like Neil, which if Neil's watching, I loved his list. So like, there's people that are just like, oh damn, your taste is awesome. I like that.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, well, forget about the fact that maybe none of the other people on the panel knew who Tim was talking about, but nonetheless, I'm really grateful for that. So thanks very much, Tim. And now, before I get into my 80s choices, you need to just bear in mind I was a kid back in the 80s. At the beginning of the 80s, I looked like this. And at the end of the 80s, I looked pretty much like this. So you might not necessarily trust my choices here, and that's okay. But let's get on with this. Now, at the start of the 80s, I very much started getting into film. And really from 1983 onwards, I started keeping lists and books about the films that I was watching. So I've got a record of every movie that I have seen since 1983. 1983 is when I started doing it. So it's been really good fun to go back through all these notebooks and just note what I was watching in the 80s. And this is what I want to just present to you now. Just something that really reflects personal choices from the 80s where I can really imagine the time and the place. So I'm not necessarily going to talk about some of the big favorites, which are ones which I certainly love, but some of those movies are timeless, if you like. So films like Back to the Future and Aliens and things like that, I can enjoy those at any kind of period. But I want to talk about ones which really take me back to specific times and places. So that's what I'm going to do. Now at 25, to kick things off, I have to talk about James Bond. I'm British. Bond movies were hugely important. Until I was of cinema going age, they were massive on TV, getting huge audiences at Christmas and bank holidays. But when I was 12, I got to go to the cinema for my first time to see a Bond movie. The Bond movie that I got to see was a Roger Moore one, and it was For Your Eyes Only. Now, whilst For Your Eyes Only nowadays might not be my favourite Bond, at the time this was just a tremendous experience, and for a number of reasons. Firstly, right at the very beginning of the 80s, there was a show on British TV called The Big Time, which was a talent show that was organised by Esther Rantzen. And in that talent show, it discovered a singer, and her name was Sheena Easton. And at that time, just a housewife, if you like, really no fame to her, but very quickly through The Big Time, she established herself as a chart hit, and she got the job of doing the For Your Eyes Only James Bond theme, and she was really glammed up for this, and she actually appeared in the credit sequence, and that was just a phenomenal thing. We're really proud of her when she did that. Now, another reason that I really love For Your Eyes Only is that it has a car chase that features a yellow Citroën de Chevaux, and at that time our family, we had a yellow Citroën Diane, so as you can imagine, it was really cool to be able to see a car chase involving that kind of car. And then the other reason that I really love this film is that it has that tremendous climax where they're climbing that huge rocky precipice to try and reach that impregnable monastery that's at the top. Now, there's another film that came out in the 70s that's called Sky Riders, that's got James Coburn in it, where he and a group of paragliders have to try and attempt a rescue mission at that same mountaintop. I really enjoyed Sky Riders, and yeah, For Your Eyes Only, that uses the same precipice. So yeah, For Your Eyes Only was just a tremendous experience at the age of, 12 I think I was when I got to see this. Absolutely love it. Okay, number 24. Now, nowadays we don't really think too much about movies that are shown in 3D. It's not necessarily such a big deal. We don't always want it, we don't always appreciate it, but In 1983, when I was 12, 13, watching a movie in 3D was a big deal. And in 1983, there were two movies that were coming out that were being shown in 3D. One was called Metal Storm, The Destruction for Jared Sin. But that one, directed by Charles Band, that didn't make it to our movie theatres. But the one that did was this one, Space Hunter. Adventures in the Forbidden Zone in 3D, starring Peter Strauss and a young Molly Ringwald here before she went into Pretty in Pink. And then the great villain of the 80s, we have Michael Ironside here as Overdog. And then just so you can see it, here's my poster. Definitely a fun little movie for the 80s. Not so great nowadays. It's not one of the greatest movies of all time, but definitely when you're 12 or 13 and you're watching Molly Ringwald having to negotiate through this maze where they had all these different objects being thrown at her and coming right at you in 3D. This was a lot of fun. Okay, at number 23. Now, when I was a kid, whilst in America you had Ebert and Siskel doing all of your movie reviews, in the UK we had a legend who is Barry Norman. Barry Norman had a film show throughout the 80s, and I was glued to Barry Norman's film show. I absolutely adored it, and I'm really thankful to Barry Norman because he just showed me so much about movies. He reviewed movies every week. He showed all the new releases that were going to be coming. He did interviews with a lot of the stars. And for me, Mr. Barry Norman is just an absolute legend. So the reason I'm mentioning him is that I vividly remember him talking about a film, which is my number 23 choice. And the reason I'm choosing it is that Barry Norman was talking about an actor who at that point I didn't really know anything about. And it was the legendary Sidney Poitier. Now, Sidney Poitier had not been in movies for 10 years, but in 1988, he returned to the cinema twice. One was in a film called Little Nikita, and the other was in this one, Shoot to Kill, which in England was called Deadly Pursuit because Shoot to Kill had different connotations at that time and was not a favourable title. So yeah, Deadly Pursuit is what we called it. But yeah, again, whilst I wouldn't call this one of the greatest movies of all time, I do thoroughly enjoy this movie. And like I say, I just vividly remember Barry Norman talking about Sidney Poitier. So that's, I think, is one of the great things about such influential people as that, is that they inspire you to look at people's filmography and get into film. Now, Sidney Poitier's film here, this also starred Tom Berenger, and this was around the same time that he had been doing really well in Platoon, so I was really liking Tom Berenger. And then Kirstie Alley is also in this, and the enjoyable thing about this film, in which Sidney Poitier plays a cop who is on the search for a killer. Kirstie Alley is leading a group of people through the mountains, and she does not know that one of the people that she is taking is a killer. And Tom Berenger is the husband of Kirstie Alley, who is a tracker. So he teams up with Sidney Poitier to track through the mountains to try and find Kirstie Alley before she gets killed by the killer. So yeah, this was a really fun film. And another reason why I really like this film is that this was all shot in beautiful British Columbia, which is where I now live. And in fact, at the end of this movie, there is a car chase, and it always amuses me because the car chase begins in downtown Vancouver, and they are driving around the terminal area there near Canada Place. But amusingly to me, as the car chase continues, they suddenly end up at a ferry terminal, and that ferry terminal is actually very close to where I live, and actually it would take them about an hour to drive there, but in this car chase they're there in just a few seconds, so that's very funny. So yeah, for its location, for the fact it's filmed in BC, and for the fact that I vividly remember Barry Norman talking about Sidney Poitier, Shoot to Kill, Deadly Pursuit, that's my number 23. Now at number 22, remember in the 80s, certainly at the beginning of the 80s, CGI was still in its infancy. And now we'd certainly had great special effects movies such as the Star Wars movies, but CGI, that was a slightly different thing. And in 1982, Disney produced Tron. And this was a movie I went to see. I remember going to see this actually not with my dad, but with my neighbour. And he was a computer technician who was really eager to see this, but didn't feel like he wanted to see it by himself as an adult. And his children were too young. So he took me along to see this. And yeah, what a tremendous film this was. And at the time, I remember very basic computer games, which were basically just lines going around a screen, but still enormous fun. And again, here is my movie poster from the time. Nice cheap magazines back then, which only cost 75p. A little bit more expensive nowadays. Look at that, isn't that lovely? Now for 21, let's talk about time travel, but no, I'm not going to talk about Back to the Future. Now, a lot of people might be familiar nowadays with this film because it's had a 4K reissue, and that's The Final Countdown. Now, this film involves a USS nuclear warship that travels back in time from 1980 to Pearl Harbor in 1941 and imagines a different scenario then. Really good fun movie. But also in the 80s there was another time travel movie that came before Back to the Future, and this is the one that I rented more often from the video stores, and I really enjoyed it, and it is The Philadelphia Experiment. Now this, in the opposite way of The Final Countdown, this involves guys on a ship in 1943, and there's an experiment to try and get them to go undetected from radar, but it accidentally goes wrong and transports Michael Paré to 1984, where he then meets up with Nancy Allen. So yeah, this was just a really enjoyable film from the 80s. I had a thoroughly good time with this. Again, it's not one of the greatest movies of all time, but hugely enjoyable for its 80s feel. Now for number 20. Now in the 80s, a lot of people were enjoying Ralph Macchio as the Karate Kid, but for me, I was into blues music, and so for me, Crossroads, where Ralph Macchio is a guitarist who plays Spanish guitar and he wants to sell his soul to the devil so that he can play the blues. This was the movie for me. I really enjoyed this one. It's Walter Hill movie. Ry Cooder again does the soundtrack on this, and we have this incredible finale that's not exactly blues, that involves Ralph Macchio playing off against Steve Vai. A huge amount of fun, this one. I absolutely love it. Crossroads. Now at number 19, and it's a movie that definitely warns you against the perils of giving lifts to strangers in your car, and that is the 1986 film The Hitcher, starring C. Thomas Howell and the great Rutger Hauer. I absolutely love this film in the 80s. It's pretty cruel, but it was gripping from start to finish, with several really memorable moments. I mean, definitely it will make you think twice about eating French fries. And also, as the back of the DVD says here, it really stretched the acting talents of Jennifer Jason Leigh. So if you've seen the movie, you'll know what is meant by that. But yeah, I absolutely adore this film, The Hitcher. Like I say, it is quite cruel in places, but it's a good one. Number 18. Now, definitely in the 80s, Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger were just tearing up the box office and just shooting everybody in sight, and we all had a glorious time watching it. Now, definitely those movies were getting a lot of news, and always on the news, and in Barry Norman's show they were talking about the death count, the number of people that were killed in all these films. Yeah, the more they talked about that, the more we just wanted to go and see them. And one of the movies that I went and saw with my dad, and it was one of the few times I went to the movies to see a film with him, when it was Sylvester Stallone in Rambo First Blood Part 2. And this was just a packed cinema. I saw it again by myself just shortly afterwards. But yes, had such a blast watching this. Sylvester Stallone rewriting Vietnam single-handedly. Huge amount of action and excitement in this one, and yeah, I absolutely thoroughly loved it at the time. Now at number 17, and it's a sexy New Orleans thriller, and it is The Big Easy, directed by Jim McBride and starring Dennis Quaid and Ellen Barkin. I absolutely love this movie, especially for its fantastic music soundtrack, which I played loads and loads of times, and I implore you, stop what you're doing, well, maybe finish my video first and have a listen to Buckwheat Zydeco Matit Fi, which is track number 3 on the album, Matit Fi. Honestly, you will be stomping your feet when you listen to that. I absolutely love that song. It goes on for about 15 minutes, but it's so infectious. Really, really loved it. Dennis Quaid also sings a song on the soundtrack on this one as well. But yeah, really great movie here from Jim McBride. He also did Breathless, starring Richard Gere. But yeah, love this one. Number 16 is a movie where I vividly remember going up to London. I used to go up to London, go to Oxford Street and going to the HMV and the Virgin Megastore there and look at all the movies and listen to music in there. And then I would go and see a movie in one of the theatres as well when I could. And I certainly remember going to Tottenham Court Road and then going to see Steve Martin in Roxanne, which was his take on the Cyrano de Bergerac tale, and I really, really enjoyed this one. It's a huge amount of fun. The pointy birds are pointy pointy, anoint my head, anointy nointy. Yeah, great fun. Now, number 15, there are certainly great moments in cinema, this being one of them, and yes, I have to go for Steven Spielberg's fantastic E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Really, really loved this one. Again, I was very young when I watched this, but it's made a huge impression on me and I absolutely adore it. I can easily watch this time and time again. Number 14. Now, director Brian De Palma was certainly having a big decade back in the 80s. Lots of films that he did then. Nowadays, I would probably go for Blowout as being one of my favourites of his from that decade. And I certainly loved The Untouchables at the time, which was perhaps his biggest box office hit. But the film that I was definitely renting from the video stores in the early 80s, and which I certainly remember vividly, is this one, Body Double. From 1984, and at the time this one kind of annoyed me to an extent because I was thinking, who the hell does Brian De Palma think he is? He's just ripping off Hitchcock. But obviously I didn't know too much about him at the time, and I was certainly also really intrigued by this film because although it had the Hitchcock vibes, it was also really sleazy and violent and kind of strange acting at times that all seemed a bit off, but it was all just really interesting. And so yeah, I absolutely love this film, and also what better way to signify the 80s. It features Frankie Goes to Hollywood doing their song Relax, and that was banned on British radio because of its lyrics. So yeah, that's really vivid memory from the 80s as well. So yeah, Body Double really stands out. At number 13, and again really remembering the cinema experience back in the 80s, and the film I'm going to choose here is the second of the Indiana Jones movies, and it is Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which I actually got to see before I got to see Raiders of the Lost Ark. I was too young to go to the cinema to see Raiders of the Lost Ark, but I saw Indiana Jones at the Temple of Doom in the summer of 1984, and then Raiders of the Lost Ark came on TV in December of 1984. Remember, back in the 80s, you would often have to wait 3 years from when a cinema had been released at the cinema before it then appeared on TV. That certainly doesn't happen nowadays. But yeah, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was just such a ride. I had such a great time watching this. I immediately went back the next day to see it again. Here's a collector's booklet that I had at the time as well. But yeah, I adore Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Fantastic. Number 12. Now here we are in 2023 and Tom Cruise is still big box office. I'm hoping to go and see Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning in just a few days time. But yeah, going back to the 80s, definitely I loved him in Rain Man. I thought that was absolutely superb, but it hasn't made my 25. But the film I definitely remember from the 80s and absolutely adoring is Risky Business. Tom was really good fun in this one. We've got the gorgeous Rebecca De Mornay, and we have that excellent soundtrack from Tangerine Dream, which I played so much. Love on the L Train, absolutely fantastic track. So yeah, I adore Risky Business. Number 11. Now, in the 80s, I certainly loved anything that was starring the wonderful Michelle Pfeiffer. And in fact, I should have Married to the Mob in this list, especially for all the shoulder pads that are in that film. But the film I want to go for here is this one, The Fabulous Baker Boys from 1989, which I absolutely love this film. And really, although, yes, we have the great Michelle Pfeiffer in this, what really makes this film special is Jeff Bridges playing with his brother Beau Bridges, and the performances in this are just so wonderful. I absolutely love their acting in this. I adore the movie, absolutely love it. The Fabulous Baker Boys. Number 10, who can forget that flap of skin on Griffin Dunn's face as his face is decaying in the wonderful John Landis movie An American Werewolf in London, which aside from that flap of skin also has the most amazing werewolf transformation scene that we've ever seen in a movie. It has that incredible dream within a dream moment, gorgeous Jenny Agutter as a nurse, and just that really fine balance between humour and shocks. This is an absolute classic and I love this movie. Number 10, and it's a movie I definitely remember at the cinema. It was incredibly gripping. The battle scenes in this felt so realistic and brutal, and there was a death scene that involves Mr. Willem Dafoe here that really made me cry. It brought a lump to my throat because it is done in slow motion with Barber's Adagio for strings playing. And it was just such an emotional moment in the movie. So yeah, I really remember seeing Platoon, and it had a big effect when I watched it. Yeah, really stunning film from Oliver Stone, and fantastic performances from Willem Dafoe and Tom Berenger and Charlie Sheen, who's never been better. Number 8, and again, when I think back to the video store days, a movie that I rented first of all, and then I was able to buy a copy, and I played the VHS copy of this so much during the 80s. I thought it was absolutely incredible, and it's Jackie Chan in Police Story, which absolutely is amazing. They destroyed a village at the beginning of the film by driving cars through it, and just such amazing stunt work throughout. Yeah, incredible movie from Jackie Chan. Had such a big effect on me when I watched this, and yeah, I've adored it ever since. Number 7, and it's that petri dish scene where they're all tied up in the chairs, so tense. Yeah, I'm talking about The Thing, which loads of people have spoken about this film already, and justifiably so. Still the best film ever in terms of practical effects, which are just so glorious to watch. Absolutely adore this film. John Carpenter's The Thing. Number 6, and I'm going to talk about 2 films, but they have to count as one. They're not going to make the overall community top 25, I know that, but I absolutely adore these films. I think it's some of the greatest storytelling that there has been in terms of a movie that is about greed and about passion and about revenge. And it is the marvellous French films Jean de Florette and Manon des Sources, Manon of the Spring, starring Gérard Depardieu, Yves Montand and Emmanuel Béart, directed by Claude Berry. These films are just absolutely glorious, definitely signify the 80s to me. A great time watching these with my family, and yeah, these are just timeless for me. I really adore these films. Number 5, and this movie definitely counts as being one in the 80s that I specifically remember enjoying with my dad. This is probably the film that my dad has enjoyed most at the cinema, at least with me, and it is Christopher Reeve in Superman 2. Yeah, we just had such a great time watching this, so memorable. We really loved Christopher Reeve, obviously. I think he's still the best Superman that we've had. Margot Kidder is just a fantastic Lois Lane in this, and then we've just got such enjoyable villains in Terence Stamp here as General Zod, and Gene Hackman obviously as Lex Luthor as well. huge amount of fun. This is the Richard Lester version. I know Richard Donner's one is re-edited and some people prefer that, but yeah, the Richard Lester one is the one we saw at the cinema, and that's the one that counts for us. Number 4, and yeah, of course, this film probably still ranks as one of my very favourite action movies of all time, and it is the 1988 Die Hard, starring Bruce Willis. Just absolutely wow, what a great time at the cinema this was, and it's been enjoyable ever since then. I never get bored of watching Die Hard. It is just absolutely fantastic, and I really love that kind of everyman feel to the action star here. I mean, obviously we had the big muscle guys, but then Bruce Willis came along and just kind of felt like an everyman taking over and crawling around in elevator shafts and doing what he had to do to survive. And wow, this was just so much fun. I absolutely love it. Die Hard. Now at number 3 is a movie which I perhaps ought to have at my number 1, because when I went back through my notebooks I could see it was actually the film that I had watched the most amount of times in the 80s. I watched this loads. I saw it 3 times at the cinema. I then hired it in the video store, and then I bought a video of it as well and watched that loads of times. But yeah, this was such fun and gory good times, and it was Sam Raimi's Evil Dead 2, Dead by Dawn. Groovy. Number 2 is a movie that feels to me like it was the film I watched the most amount of times in the 80s, but like I say, that was Evil Dead 2. But this one is definitely very special to me. It came out in 1984. At that time I was still pretty fresh-faced and had my dimples, and this film was an 18 certificate, and I was only 15 and I needed to be able to get to see it. So I bought a ticket for Gremlins, but then I took a detour and went into the cinema to see Arnold Schwarzenegger in The Terminator. And wow, I had such a blast watching this. This was just incredible. Now obviously if you're younger than me, and most of you are, you would have been born in the 90s, and The Terminator 2 quite rightly would seem like an absolutely fantastic and better film. But at the time when this came out, and Arnie was still very little known, I mean obviously he had been in Conan the Barbarian, but that wasn't a massive box office hit or anything. But this was just incredible. Yeah, and the effects that they used, that what James Cameron was able to achieve on a low budget was just fantastic. Michael Biehn was just incredible in this. Linda Hamilton was incredible. Yeah, absolutely loved The Terminator, and I watched it so many times in the 80s. Like I say, it feels like it's the movie that I watched the most, but yeah, Evil Dead 2 actually is the one I watched a little bit more. But yeah, The Terminator, incredible movie. Okay, so finally my number 1 choice, and for me it's a movie that very much feels 80s, and I love it for that fact. It's a movie where we have a leader of a pack who steals the Queen of Pop, and Soldier Boy has to come to her rescue, and we're talking about Walter Hill's Streets of Fire. I absolutely love this movie. It is just so much fun. So yeah, we have got music here that's written by you know, Jim Steinman and the guys that used to write for Meat Loaf and Bonnie Tyler, so very much puts it in that kind of 80s style. But we've also got a fantastic score from Ry Cooder again. Love him. And I just think Michael Paré, a really great 80s actor, and I think he just suits this role so well. Yeah, this is a Walter Hill film, all built and filmed on big sound stages. It looks glorious. It is a glorious film, and absolutely it's my number 1. I love it to death. Streets of Fire. Okay, so there you go. Those are the 25, and yes, I know I've left out so many great popular movies. I know that. I love those movies as well. The 80s was definitely a great decade. Okay, thanks very much for watching. I really appreciate it. All the best to you. Enjoy your 25 lists. Do submit them to Tim if you haven't done so already. You have until 31st of July to do that, and then he will be doing a live stream in August as well to present the overall findings. Okay, all the best to you. Bye bye.